Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from the CUNY TV Foundation, Capital One Bank, Genova Burns, Gian Tomasi and Webster, New York Community Bank, the Witkoff Group, M&T Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company. Additional funding is provided by grants from AKA Hotels, Corming Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Colliers International NYC, Cushman & Wakefield, Customers Bank, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Eastern Union Funding, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Herrick Feinstein, LLP, Hersha Hospitality Trust, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Centurion Holdings, Margolin Weiner and Evans, LLP, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Matone Group, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, Newbanks, People's United Bank, RBS Citizens Bank, SJP Properties, Sterling and Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, Urban American, and These Friends.
So, they get these kids, they grow up in Manhattan, yeah, they go to public school, then they go to Horace Mann, then they find out Lafayette College, and then, MBA. And what happens next? Jewelry. No idea what jewelry is. Jewelry, involved in so many aspects of jewelry, and then public service. EDC, all of these jobs, trustee, jewelry, and more important, a fellow friar, not a fellow friar, the prior of the friars, David Kornstein. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Michael. That's quite an introduction.
So let's go back, your grandparents, where they came from, and then we'll talk about your parents, and then we'll get to you.
Good.
Okay,
Good.
tell me about grandparents. Where they
My
came.
grandparents on my father's side came from Russia, and on my mother's side from Hungary.
So we know they came to America, but we have no idea how they ended up in your father's family in the Midwest. Any idea how?
No, I really don't know how, but that's where they ended up. My father was in Detroit, and my mother came from Toledo, Ohio.
And then they came to New York City, right? They came.
Correct.
Your mother was a school teacher.
That is correct.
And your father was an entrepreneur in the rug business.
In the rug cleaning.
And you were telling me that people at that time would bring rugs into the stores. There was always
Well, in the summer, most people did not have wall-to-wall carpeting. They had loose rugs. And in the summer, they would pick those rugs up, clean them and store them, and then they'd be returned in the fall. And he operated leased apartments in most of New York City.
But the real money wasn't in the cleaning. It was in the insurance.
That's very true. He actually gave the contracts out for the cleaning to a rug cleaning company that was a professional. And then he would charge an insurance rate to the consumer that phoned in.
Right, as you said, minimum was like $100 of insurance.
It was $3 per 100 valuation, which in the 30s and 40s was a nice sum of money. And there were stores like Wanamaker's where the clients had very expensive rugs, and they would then get a rug insured for $5,000 or $10,000. And he would get $3 per 100 valuation, and that was his profit.
Now, was there an insurance company, or was he really running his own self-insurance?
No. There was an insurance company, but they reported what came in insurance about 4 months after the insurance was paid. So, and I don't believe there was ever an incident that happened with a rug. If there was, they paid it off.
But it's interesting because that gave you, later on when we go on, that was a way that you learned a little bit about entrepreneurship and, about the retail business. You were born and you first lived up in Dyckman Street?
And then after that, we moved down to 111th Street and Riverside Drive. Went to PS 168 on 109th Street between Amsterdam and Columbus Avenue, which was at that time an area that resembled a war zone, and you basically had to fight your way in and out of school every day.
So then you went to Horace Mann. How'd that happen?
Well, my mother, as you say, was a school teacher and believed very firmly in letting me get the best education that I could. And Horace Mann then was a great school. It was a good enough school that we sent our son there, and it was a good enough school that now my grandson goes there. But I was the first one that went.
And you went there when it was all male?
It was all male, and it was a 6-year school, whereas today it starts in kindergarten.
So when you were at Horace Mann, I think part of your working was you went into your father's office, right?
I'd go and help my dad, especially in the season, which was in May, June, and July was his busiest times.
And what do you do over there?
I answered the phones, which I guess would have resembled perhaps a bookmaking joint today, because all the stores in New York, they all filtered into one office. And one line would be for Wanamaker's, one would be for Macy's, one would be for
Hearns.
Stearns or Hearns. And there was a different price at each store to have your rug cleaned, although it was going to the same rug cleaning company.
Right, but it depended on the higher class of the store at that time.
That's correct. Which is very true in the other area that I went into.
Was it in high school that you got to work up in the Catskills or at the Lido Hotel? Because I think
I worked at both and was not...
you were not the best waiter.
No,
Tell me about the story about the guy giving the extra $20 that you wouldn't.
I never caught the knack of really carrying the tray in one hand the way most waiters carry a tray. I was always afraid it would fall, so I would carry it with 2 hands. And they gave me the most miserable station, which was all the way in the rear to one side or another. And then I would put the dirty dishes and cups on the tray and bring it back to the kitchen, walking down the aisle like this. And every now and then a little would spill over the side of the tray. And I had one customer, a wonderful guy, that said to me, "I know this isn't what you're going to do for a living." And he had a lot of empathy for me and said, "I'm going to give you $20 a week," which was a fortune in the 50s. "But do me a favor, don't walk down this aisle because I don't need the spilled coffee on my jacket." So that ended my career as a busboy, but we worked very, very hard, all of us that did that, and most kids did at that time.
You're living in Manhattan. You went to school up in Riverdale. You find Easton, Pennsylvania. How'd that happen?
Well, we
Lafayette College in
had
Easton.
Lafayette College.
And it wasn't part of the Divinical School.
No, it was not. We had a headmaster that we were the first graduating class that he had in 1956. I started in 1950 and graduated in 56. His name was Mitchell Gratwick, a fabulous man. And he knew the 100 young fellas that were in my class. And he knew me very, very well and felt that I would be much more suited to be in a school that was a smaller school where I could really thrive and be a bigger fish in a pond than a school like Michigan, which I had always felt I had wanted to go to. He felt I'd be better off in a school like
I mean, the big house at that time only held 103,000. Now it's 108,000.
Right.
So tell me about your time in Easton.
Easton was a marvelous experience for me, as was Lafayette. Easton was an experience because most young people that grow up in the city of New York feel that New York is the whole world, and obviously it's not. And you see a completely different life going to a small rural town like Easton, Pennsylvania. It's a completely different mentality. That coupled with the fact of going to Lafayette, which at that time was a school that was comprised mainly of Presbyterian students. There were quota systems then. You couldn't get into a lot of fraternities. You were limited where you could go. But we had to go to services twice a week. And
It wasn't Hillel.
no, no, they didn't have a Hillel representation there. But it taught me what the religion of the United States was. And that, coupled with the rural town, really showed me a whole different life. And then coupled with going in the reserves after that and meeting people there that were completely different. That gave me a background that really served me very, very well in business.
You graduate Lafayette. You're thinking of law school,
Yeah.
but the family really didn't know anybody in the law school.
Correct.
On the situation. So instead of law school, you go for your MBA.
Correct.
At NYU. But at that same time, I'm not sure if it was going at the MBA, you joined the Army Reserve.
Well, it wasn't on a voluntary basis.
No, we some of us joined the Army Reserve, or some
Right.
were enlisted because
Right, right.
But you were on, and I still remember I was in the Army Reserve in Fort Tilden, which was in Rockaway. So nobody would believe that in the Rockaways they really had man-made mountains with guns. I mean, it was dangerous for me to hold that. Now you were a cook.
I was, please, not a cook. I was an executive chef.
Wait,
They didn't have cooks. They had
so
executive
you were an executive chef. Now, this was 42nd Street, the reserve unit over there. People don't realize it's been replaced by an apartment house because there's nothing left. And you told me one time with the K rations and the Carnegie Deli. Tell the story. I think it's a good one.
Well, we used to, the cooks, as you would say, had to be at the meeting at 4 in the morning or 3:30 in the morning.
And you had come back from the Copa.
I would leave the Copacabana or the Copa Lounge and go directly to 42nd Street and put on my khaki uniform. And for lunch for the reservists that came in on Sunday, they had K rations or C rations, I forget which they called it, but it was from the Second World War. When you opened these cans, Michael, the stench could kill you. It was so bad. And I said, how come the guys would come through with lunch, they wouldn't put a fork in anything. They never got to the food because the smell was so atrocious. So I was friendly with Max Asness that owned the Stage Deli. Very famous place, as you know, in New York. Wonderful guy. And I told him the story, and I said, Max, could you do something maybe one Sunday for the troops that are here to help America? And he said, I'll be happy to. And he, one Sunday, sent over tables and tablecloths and pastrami and corned beef and all the meats that they had at the deli. And he set it all up. He had waiters. And then the guys came out for lunch. And the general that was there, I thought he was going to have a coronary. He came out, he looked at these tables. He said, this is supposed to be wartime conditions. You can't have Max Asness come to the field and cater. But they couldn't do anything to me because I had nothing on my sleeve.
Right, they couldn't take away.
I was the lowest.
You were
I was the lowest
PFC
of the
button.
low. I wasn't even a PFC. I don't know what I had. I was a virgin on my arm. I had absolutely.
Okay, so now you're at NYU,
Yeah.
finishing your MBA, and you're reading the Women's Wear Daily, and you find an article that the legendary, we won't talk where they are today, at that time, J.C. Penney, headquartered in Manhattan, I think at 1301 or 1251
I was first on 34th Street.
on 30, that they are planning to lease out departments. And this kid, you're 22?
Yes.
22, you make a phone call. Tell me the story about this.
Well, the Penny Company at that time was doing maybe $8-9 billion, had 1,000 stores or so. And they felt that they could expand, and they were right, expand their revenues if they added some service departments, restaurants, automotive centers, photo studios, watch repair, beauty salons. And they hired a vice president named Henry Goldsmith to go find all these various licensees. And then watches were not quartz watches. They were only analog mechanical watches. And like an automobile, people felt they had to bring the watch in every year or two, have it serviced, or it might disintegrate on their wrist. So my thought was that we would open 1,000 stores. A watch could be taken in anywhere in a J.C. Penney store for a flat fee and then mailed back to the consumer. And if I took in one watch per month per store, by 23 and a half, I could retire.
So you go see Harold.
I go see Henry Goldsmith, and he listens to the presentation that today I couldn't even contemplate making, but I was in a very academic mode, and he listened to it attentively and then asked me, well, who else do you do this for? I said, don't worry. I'm going to take care of the Penny Company like no one has ever taken care of it. He looked at me like I was crazy. He laughed at first, and he said, I don't think we really need you for this. But we hit it off very well. He said, someday we're going to do business.
And what happened someday? 6
He
months?
called me a few months later and said, would you like to go into the fine jewelry business? I said, I was never in a jewelry store. He said, I'll tell you what. I'll give you the name J.C. Penney. You try it. I think you'll like it. I think you'll be pretty good at it. I want you to go out to the Lake Success Shopping Center where there's a J.C. Penney store and meet the store manager.
Who you said at that time was really the ruler of the department store.
There wasn't any centralized business. Everything was done in the store. And I went out, saw him, and negotiated a lease with him, and opened a fine jewelry department in J.C. Penney.
Now, you knew nothing about this.
Nothing.
And you were up on the second floor, but you had a good location near the escalator, right?
Right.
So this was, so people
Excuse
had
me. At that time, they didn't even have an escalator.
okay.
You only had stairs.
You had a good location near the stairs, okay? And you knew nothing about jewelry. And your parents, you know, lent their savings, okay, for you to go into the jewelry business.
That is correct.
Now, the good thing is that Dad had an entree, and you had learned this from the days of the carpet cleaning, rug, insurance, whatever we want to call it, that from this one J.C. Penney, what happened next?
Well, I don't remember what they thought we might do in business. At that time, there wasn't any jewelry sold in a department store. It was only sold, they didn't have QVC, it was strictly sold in a jewelry store. And they probably figured we'd do $100,000 or $200,000 in business. And we did, I don't know, $800,000 in business the first year. So everybody was thrilled with it. And
So they sent you to Bayshore now, right?
then they opened what they called a phase store in their first regional mall, which was in the South Shore Mall in Bayshore, Long Island. And we opened the store there, and that was highly successful as well.
Now, your parents would take the train out to visit you?
They used to come every Friday night, and whatever I needed to replenish inventory, I'd call some vendors, and they'd bring the inventory out, and then we'd all sell together Friday.
So then, okay, from J.C. Penney, you have a couple of stores. How'd you get into the other stores? Corvettes, Macy's, I mean.
Well, I became friendly with the people at Allied Stores. Tom Masiosi was the chairman then. And I went to him because we had, as you say, the rug cleaning concessions in all these stores, so I knew the store presidents. And I went to them and I wanted to open up a department. I told them what we were doing at Penny's, and they allowed me to come into their store. I really knew how to operate within a department store, which is you're a guest in somebody's home, and you have to treat the store that way and the customer that way. So we expanded, and maybe over the next 30 years, I had opened 40 or some stores.
Right. So you have 40 stores, okay, and you said to me the real key to this business was consignment.
Well, the key for me, because I didn't have any money, was consignment. So I went to the vendors.
To work with you.
Unfortunately, in the jewelry industry, the turn of the inventory is around one and a quarter times a year.
Right.
So cash flow is very, very important. And you do about 50% of your year's business the last 4 weeks before Christmas. But you need inventory for the whole year. So I went to the vendor community and I said, look, I think things are going very well for me here. I like this business. I'm going to stay in it. I think I'll be a factor in it. But I can't afford to pay you. You have to give me the inventory on consignment. And they looked, I guess, at a young 22, 23-year-old kid, and they said, let's take a shot with them. And they gave me the inventory on consignment.
Now you have this business, and then in the mid-'80s, you're running 40, 50 stores around different places around the country and all this, and you get a phone call from the legendary Harold Janine,
Right.
the former
Fabulous
chairman
man.
the chairman of IT&T, which was one of the first conglomerates. You know, he owned all the other
Yep.
businesses.
Yep.
And he says, "Kid, what? You go visit him once. He's a little. He kept you waiting, and he throws you an annual report of a company."
Of a company called Seligman and Latz. It was a New York Stock Exchange company.
Jewelry and beauty salons.
Beauty salons. I can't even say that word, beauty salons. But they had about 7,500 beauty salons all over the world, from South Africa to Europe to all over America. Saks, Neiman Marcus, Harrods, Gallery Lafayette, fabulous, fabulous stores. I knew nothing about that business, but they also had a company by the name of Finley, which is the same type of business that I had, only maybe 10 times larger than what my company was.
So 3.5 years later, after sitting with Harold, you and Harold do a buyout, a leverage buyout of Seligman and Latz.
Right. We started, you say 3 years later. That was a long 3 years for me. But I met Harold in May of '82, and we completed our transaction in December of 1985. It was the height of the LBO in America, and we bought the company, took it private. We paid $31 million for the company. We put up $1 million in cash and had $30 million in debt.
And then afterwards, you and Harold went public again, took the company public, and then subsequently later on did another deal with the legendary Tom Lee, subsequently over there.
Right.
And Finley grew, because I got to talk about the rest of your life, Finley grew to what, 1,200 stores?
Yeah, we had 1,200 stores, and we were doing well over $1 billion. And I just loved it. The concept of what we did with consignment inventory, by the way, continued. And that stayed with us right till the end. And at the end, we had maybe $600 million on consignment.
Right. It was a multi-billion-dollar business.
Right.
Then you retired and you became chairman emeritus, and then you took the second part of your life, okay, which is really interesting because your second part of your life has been a lot of community service. But before I talk about community service, what do you know about horses? I mean, on both sides, okay. You were the chairman of OTB,
Right.
and you were also in the horse business with Bill Mack and Robert Baker.
Right.
How'd you get into the horse business?
Well, they're both good friends, and I was having dinner as we normally do, the Bakers and my wife and I. And he had been in the horse business, I guess, most of his life. He loves the track and had owned horses, had a couple of successful ones. But as most people that are owners of horses, they don't do this to make a living. It's a tough business to be successful in. So I said to him, the next time you buy a horse, I'd like to go in with you. He said, forget about it. You can't make a dime in this. It doesn't work. I said, let's take a shot and buy a horse. And my wife, Sheila, named all of our horses. And the first horse we bought, she named CB Connection, Cornstein Baker Connection. Horse never made it to the track. I don't know, his hoof fell off or something happened to him, and it didn't work out. And Bob said to me after that, I told you, this is not going to work. It's terrible. Forget about it. I said, one more time, just one more. And we bought a horse, and it was more than we had wanted to pay for it. Wayne Lucas was our trainer.
And it got up to the Breeders' Cup, right?
Got to the Breeders' Cup. The name of the horse was Grand Slam, and a fabulous horse.
With 2 minutes left, I got to get to some other things. As I said, community involvement. You were the chairman of OTB.
Correct.
You're still on the commission on the Javits Center.
Correct.
You were vice chairman of the Economic Development Corporation.
Correct.
Battery Park City Development Corporation.
Right.
Park East Synagogue, needless to say, the Friars, which is too close to me.
My brother Fry.
Okay. And let's talk a little bit about the joy of your life. As you said, you have a son, Mark, who's married to Natasha.
Correct.
And you have a picture with you of your grandson, okay?
I always have a picture.
Right.
I always have a picture. This is my grandson, Danny.
So
love him
Okay.
to death.
and Mark is a very prominent sports agent.
He's doing very well. He represents about 35 basketball players and loves what he's doing. More importantly, I love him. He's been a fabulous.
And then to continue on, the last couple of years you've been involved with a company called Circa.
Yes.
And Circa's businesses.
Circa's primary business is buying jewelry from the public. We're not one of these cash for gold places. We compete more Sotheby's or Christie's. And the advantage that we have is not only the trust that people have in our company, but that if you like the offer that's made to you, you'll receive a check right away.
Right.
You don't have to wait for an auction.
So, for the kid who had no idea of what jewelry was, to be chairman and operating around the world, Finley Fine Jewelry, to do a lot of community fairs, you've had an interesting life, and I'm really happy I've been able to have it profile it today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate it.